Our brain is floating around in this pitch black little pond in our head, and it's receiving stimuli from all of our various senses. They're not seeing through a window. Our eyes are not windows. There's no little brain person looking with their little brain eyes out our eyes, right? Our eyes are making electrical signals going into a brain in a black box. Essentially, what's happening in our minds is what's called a controlled hallucination. This feeling, these electrical impulses from my ear area of my brain are indicating a certain thing is happening. So imaging on a pair of speakers is a very complicated thing that's happening. And we're able to fool our little hallucinating organ in our head into believing that there's a band playing. And it's an awesome thing to be able to do. And the fact that we tapped into that capability decades and decades and decades ago is just the fucking coolest thing. For me, it's what makes high-end audio awesome, is the fact that we can hallucinate that Ella Fitzgerald is alive and singing with Ray Brown and Oscar Peterson in my damn room right now while I'm having a beer. And I can pause her and go take a piss and come back, and she'll still be there, and she'll still be just as awesome, right?
Yeah. Welcome to Season 9, Episode 13, our interview with John DeVore of DeVore Fidelity. We have a really intriguing interview with him that covers a lot of different bases. Before we do a deep dive into that, first, don't forget to check out our record weight, our PTA-sponsored solid bronze record weight that's available for purchase on the site. You just go to the website, up in the navigation bar, it says record weight. If you have a Christmas gift that you are looking for, something to shop or just something for yourself, this is a pretty cool opportunity to help support the podcast, but also get a really cool record weight at the same time. Also, we have some really big shows coming up for the end-of-year wrap-up stuff that we do. Our Product of the Year Awards, our Black Friday guide, and our Winter's Buyer's Guide for the holiday season. So much cool stuff coming out, so keep your eyes and ears tuned to that. And also don't forget that Mark Phillips is back from his travels abroad, and he has updates from that journey for everyone to check out on the website, along with our usual reviews. So that's it. Tons of fun stuff coming up. Expect more updates on the podcast, more updates on the site. And as we say, on with the show. Here we go. John DeVore of DeVore Fidelity. Today's episode of The Occasional Podcast is brought to you by The Voice That Is, the award-winning dealer that proudly represents a refined selection of elite brands featuring Tidal Audio, Doman Audio, Ideon Audio, Siltec cables, and more. Providing personalized service, The Voice That Is carefully selected brands are the finest companies in the world, each of which at the top of their category and represents exceptional high quality, performance, and above all, musicality. Check out a full list of Doug's world-class products at thevoicethatis.com. And if you are attending Capitol Audio Fest next weekend, stop by The Voice That Is room to experience several new products in person, along with the North American premiere of the all-new Tidal Contriva G3 loudspeakers and the Siltec Ruby Crown cables. Today's episode of The Occasional Podcast is brought to you by Music Hall. Music Hall has a no-nonsense approach to hi-fi. They're not here to sell you gimmicks or fancy buzzwords, just great-sounding turntables and components offered at a fair price. They've been doing this since 1985 and haven't budged an inch from their formula. Music Hall knows it's all about the music, not the fluff. If you're serious about hi-fi and want a company that's serious about it too, head over to their website at musichallaudio.com. That's MusicHallaudio.com. Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us today. John DeVore returns! I love the big flashy title. John, I see it like in a marquee, like in a movie. John DeVore returns with an exclamation mark. That's how I view
Traveling lights, maybe an arrow pointing to the play now button.
Yeah. Or it's like one of those Vegas arrows. It's like dee 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 dee.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Love that. Actually, John, I think you were season 1 or season 2, such an early, gracious guest to come on the show back when we were just a nubbins of a show. And now look at us. We're still a nubbins of a show. But we appreciate you coming back.
A magnificent nubbins.
John DeVore, as many of you guys know, he is the proprietor and designer for DeVore speakers.
DeVore Fidelity.
DeVore Fidelity. And they make speakers. And do you make more than speakers?
No.
You've been around a while. And if you guys want to get more of John's backstory, feel free to check out that earlier episode, because we really dive into, where he's from, how he got into the hobby and all that. We're not going to kind of revisit all of that in this episode, but what I really wanted to start off with is it's been a minute. So how and what have you been up to? And in parlay to that, also kind of what have you kind of learned yourself? Because I feel like as people, we're always in the process of learning. I'm always learning. And since you're designing and probably looking at stuff all the time, is there something that has changed in recent years? But start with the products, because I think the big news really ultimately is that you've released a new flagship product between this time and that time. So maybe you want to start there.
Yep. Yes. So I was certainly already in development for the O reference when we spoke, but that was a many-year project. That started happening with the very beginning of the orangutan. So when I was designing the O96, which has been out for at least 12 years now, something like that. The original intention was for the O96 to be the middle of 3. And the O93 followed right away as the one below the 96, and the reference flagship just took a lot longer, and it grew in scope. The longer it took to design, the more ridiculous the project became. So in between that time, I designed and released the Gibbon 10, which I believe was around the time that we last spoke. So the Gibbon 10 essentially is a streamlined silverback. And the silverback for years was our flagship product. The Gibbon 10 is essentially the same as a silverback, but with a few things learned along the way applied, and in an easier to manufacture cabinet with less flashy styling. That was kind of the goal, was to make it a little bit more universal, a little bit more applicable. And satisfying that itch to sort of update the silverback, for me, it felt like it liberated me to just go crazy with the reference, the O reference. And that's kind of what ended up happening. So the O reference, I'll sort of give it a quick physical description. The top tier is 4 cabinets, but each cabinet is about the size, it's identical from the front in size to an O96. So it's these sort of 4 low cabinets on stands in your room. 2 of them are what we call base machines, and they are powered base units. And then 2 of them are the main units. We call the OREF A's. The system as a whole operates as an augmented two-way. So the OREF A's are essentially a two-way, recognizable from the roots are clearly recognizable back to the O96. It's a little bit bigger than a 1-inch horn-loaded tweeter and a 10-inch paper woofer. But from there, we went crazy. We went crazy with materials. The woofer now has a cast and machined bronze chassis instead of zinc, which is what all the rest of our speakers use. It has a bespoke, really radical Alnico magnet on the back instead of a more typical ferrite ceramic magnet. The pole piece, all the steel parts that make up the motor around the coil and everything, those are all machined instead of stamped. They're all machined steel. Just very exotic technologies applied to what is essentially an old-fashioned 10-inch paper cone.
And that is exactly what I was thinking while you were speaking. A lot of metals, new design, new tech, but still the same material choice for the cone that's been around since almost forever.
Over 100 years. Oh, yeah.
Why?
Untreated paper, even.
Untreated paper, even.
Yeah.
With all the new bang whiz coating, specialty coating, all kinds of coatings, right?
There's a lot of things going on. So a speaker cone has a very simple job, but it's a difficult one. And essentially what they're doing, a speaker cone has the voice coil attached at the neck, at the throat, which is sort of the narrowest, it's the smallest circle. So it's kind of the center right around where the dust cap would be or a phase plug. And that coil is being driven by the electrical signal. And so it's moving back and forth in a very specific pattern. And the job of the cone is essentially to amplify that little coil moving. So it has a lot of things that it needs to be. It needs to be light so that the coil isn't losing articulation and power to heat because it's pushing something that's got a lot of mass. Lightness also allows the cone to move back and forth and stop and start more quickly. It also needs to be rigid so that it's not flexing and wobbling and creating its own additional sounds, sounds that are not what is in the musical signal that it's trying to reproduce. And then it needs to also have a certain amount of damping. Every material, and when it's made into an object, is going to resonate at some point. So the resonance of a material is based on its mass, its stiffness, its hardness, its thickness, density, all those kinds of things go into it, and its shape. And so every different kind of cone material, including coated materials, they all have a different resonance, and they all have a different way of dealing with the resonance when it comes. So something like a plastic cone, a classic polypropylene cone, that is a very damped material. So it tends to be a little heavier, but when you look at the raw response, it doesn't have a big ragged peak. It's not resonating. So John Atkinson actually came up with a great analogy, and he was talking about metal dome tweeters, and he calls it the oil can resonance. So if you take an empty soda can and you just press it with your finger, it goes kink. Mm-hmm. It's like a very sharp little bing, right? So that's an undamped metal resonance. So if you were to look at that on a spectrum analyzer, there would be a really big, sharp peak, and that would be it. But it would be very high in magnitude. Mm-hmm. If you were to take a plastic cup and kind of push it, it would kind of go gook, gook, and there would be a less sharp peak. It would go less high because it's sort of self-damping to some extent. A paper cup, when you push it, almost isn't going to make any sound. And so it's sort of all of those things go into the recipe.
Wow, that does not speak well for fans of all aluminum dome tweeters. Right. Which, listen, I'm going to say up front, I've heard great aluminum dome tweeters out there. Some people have made them sing. But the collective mass, the zeitgeist, there is a following of anti-aluminum tweeters out here. Right. And I don't know if that has something to do with it, but...
Well, the industry is moving away from them as well, if you notice. So one of the earliest and strongest proponents of hard dome tweeters was Wilson Audio. They always had Kevlar, and they even had a fiberglass tweeter for a while, and then they used titanium for a while. Now all of their products are textile domes. A lot of it, not all of it, definitely there's a lot of really solid engineering going on, but a lot of it was market-driven in the 80s especially. MB Quart, and there were these companies that came out with these hard dome tweeters. MB Quart was one of the first of the titanium domes. And it was a marketing thing. If you didn't have a titanium dome tweeter, you weren't getting all of the detail, And in the 80s, those tweeters were fucking awful. Can I say fucking on this podcast?
Yeah, if you want.
Fucking awful. They rang, and every tweeter, whether it's textile or whether it's beryllium or whether it's diamond, they all will ring at some point. And modern hard tweeters now ring very, very high. So the resonance is pushed technically way above what we're perceiving, above 20,000.
It's above 20. Okay, they push
generally
it above 20,000.
Speaking, yeah. Or, and this is kind of went hand in hand with the evolution of these hard dome tweeters, is how, as a speaker designer, not as necessarily as a transducer designer, but as a speaker designer, how do you deal with that resonance? And there was one of two ways. One, you could just let it be and say, hey, it's ultrasonic, it doesn't matter, which is debatable, right? Why do we have high sampling rate digital if you can't hear anything above 20K, right? The only point of high sampling rate is to go above 20K. The other thing that a designer could do is basically notch filter it so that you have essentially the response from that speaker system falls off a cliff above 20K. Again, sacrificing
Through a crossover network, right?
Yeah, some sort of a crossover filter, or some you would put like little, they would call them acoustic lenses or something. It would have an actual little object in front of the tweeter to absorb, because generally speaking, the resonance shoots more like a laser beam straight out. So they would put a little thing to absorb it.
So instead of having like just like a fall off and it extends all the way up, you're talking about literally like shelving it into a narrower field. Like this tweeter only goes so low and goes so high.
Exactly. They roll it off on the top and bottom. Yeah, exactly.
I'm actually not aware of any manufacturers specifically that do this, but what is your thoughts on that? Is that acoustically pleasing or probably not a good idea?
It's problematic, yeah.
Yeah, it's problematic.
And I don't see a lot of people now using those filters on the top. I think it does too much damage overall to your detail retrieval. You're adding what a lot of people consider unnecessary crossover components and complexity. And every time you have a crossover happening anywhere in that, you're introducing phase issues. You get sort of a group delay. So whenever you can avoid that, it's good. And so the manufacturers of these tweeters and the designers of these tweeters have been able to push that resonance so that it's higher. And in some cases, some of these materials, they're actually including some amount of damping in there. And so when the ring does happen, it's brought down to something more like what a textile dome might have or something like that. Yeah.
Damn interesting. That actually, that adds new color, because the conversation about aluminum has always been there in the background of a lot of these interviews that I've done. But like, no one's put it into scope in terms of timing, because I don't know what happened in the 80s, but I feel like when it comes to sound and music and the way, I think maybe it was definitely elevated by the idea of excitement for a new frontier in digital sound or like, if I'm allowed to swear on the podcast, shit got kind of weird. Like, it got weird from a production standpoint on the other side. Now you're saying this aluminum dome thing. It's like things are piling up where I feel like we put the cart before the horse sometimes, where we got it was almost like that Jurassic Park idea that we just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. And that kind of bit us in the ass for about a decade or so in some
Absolutely.
Some aspect,
The other thing that happened, another real trend in the 80s, setting aside the material of the tweeter, there were two other big trends. One had started before the 80s, and that was the decrease of sensitivity of speakers and the increase in power, certainly power required of amplifiers. And so high-end went from having medium or low-powered tube amplifiers with very big horn systems gradually from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and to the 80s, much lower sensitivity speakers, either sealed box or smaller vented boxes with much smaller woofers, and solid-state amplifiers, and then solid-state amplifiers with more and more and more power. And hand in hand with that is the other trend, which is this is the one that's absolutely, it's a fashion trend more than anything else. This was, as far as I'm concerned, didn't have a technical footing. Didn't present itself in a real technical way. And that is the everything wanted to be a skinny supermodel. So speakers all became narrow towers. When I started in the industry, I was building as a hobbyist. I was building speakers since the early 80s. But I joined the industry as a retail salesman in New York at the end of the 80s. And one of the lines that I was selling that I loved was Boston Acoustics. And Boston Acoustic speakers were very affordable, big, friendly, great-sounding speakers, played all kinds of music, and they were wide baffle. They were essentially 8-inch and 10-inch two-ways, or three-ways. They had a three-way as well. And they were wide. The cabinets were wider than they are deep. And it was very classical. It was very throwback to like what you would imagine a 70s speaker would look like. And while I was there, within a year of me starting to work at that shop, Boston Acoustics changed their whole line from the A series, which is what I just described, to the T series. And the T series were all towers, and they were all narrow. And something that in the A series would have been maybe an 8-inch two-way with a tweeter and an 8-inch woofer became a two-way with a tweeter and two 6-inch woofers in a narrower profile. And they didn't sound as good. They absolutely didn't sound as good. But they were marketing them and everything. And at one point, he was the main speaker guy at Boston Acoustics at the time, came into the store to say hi, do a little sales training, talk about the technology. And I took him to the side and I was like, I'm sorry to say this, but I always liked the A series speakers better. And I found they were kind of easier to sell and they sounded amazing with this particular amp that I love. And he was like, yeah, but we had to design them. The market was demanding, all of their biggest retails were demanding skinny tower speakers. And so we had to do it. The advantages were always touted as they image better, right? There's less baffle to get in the way. Mm-hmm. That was misleading. There are ways that you could kind of talk your way into having a technical basis for that statement, but there was a lot of drawbacks to skinny speakers. In sensitivity, you're adding complexity. You're trying to get these multiple narrow speakers to do what one slightly larger speaker could have done so much more easily. You're losing sensitivity. You're losing the way the speaker projects sound into a room. A wide speaker projects more of its sound forward and less of it to the sides. There was a lot of stuff going on, and so that is the other thing that happened in the 80s. Wow, let's round it back to what you were talking about. So yeah, that combined with hair metal and terrible mixes.
Oh yeah, I saw this on a production video. The envelope filter on the snare. So there was like this, like in Prince in the 80s, they were saying, we got this new sound, and it was like so popular. Like you're saying, it's like this popular sound, this envelope filter, and if you listen for it on the snare, it's like this crazy electronically gated like snap of a snare. And they're like, and the person they were interviewing was like, yeah, I don't know why we chose that, but it was popular. Don't blame me, please. But like, it was like she's acknowledging that in hindsight.
Well, everyone wanted to make their drum set sound like an 808.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that was the trend. Everyone, it was like that was the sound. It was cool.
Yeah, it was
and
cool.
So actual live drums just got crunched. Yeah. Cymbals just sounded like blasts of white noise.
Yeah, and I've actually seen people sample white noise instead of cymbals at times. They just clip it really short, like either for the hi-hat, not a crash obviously, but like like that technique is a thing too, where it's like just like a legitimate transfer of energy. So it's interesting that you say all that, because when we look at your product line, aren't they kind of divided into those two-eyed cams, really?
Yes.
Not very skinny, but you have definitely a wide speaker and a narrow speaker, and they're divided by the orangutan.
Yeah, the orangutan series are the wide ones, and the gibbons are the narrow ones. That's right.
What's your reaction to, there was a definite move in this direction from KEF as of late. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. I think it's LS60. They have a new tower that came out. It's fully like all-in-one, streaming and capable, like the wireless version of the LS50 they did, but it's a tower, and it's very, very narrow. Even more narrow than yours. They just have their little concentric driver tweeter in the front, smaller than before, and then the bass drivers on the side, and from what I've read, and I don't quote me.
It's like the blades. The blades were also very, very
but even
narrow.
more narrow than that.
Yeah,
and they're saying the same thing now. We don't quote me. This is just what I think I read. I'm not positive on this, but I believe the idea was that again, market demand. People are saying for home theater or aesthetic reasons, we did our market research. And if this wants to be a big mainstream speaker that bleeding edge guys adopt because it had all the new tech in it to stream directly to it with no other amp, it's an active. That we need to have this profile. And it's even skinnier than what you're talking about.
Right.
So I'm like wondering if we're coming back to this full circle, or is this kind of just like a thing where we're making educated guesses on what we think and then throw it to the market and hope it works. And if not, well, we'll just do it wider next time or go back.
Right. I think it really is market pressure. I do think. I don't think it's the manufacturers manufacturing a market pressure for them to now build equipment to and hope that they were right. I think it really is there is market pressure. People like that. They want it to disappear in a room.
Right.
A lot of speakers are they don't have like a furniture grade finish. They're not beautiful objects. They tend to be sort of techie looking. Yeah. And so there's a push-pull in terms of what gets to exist in shared spaces. And I guess the attitude that something that's very narrow is almost not even there, right? I guess you don't see it as much. So sure, you can have something that looks super high tech and does what you need it to do, and someone else might be happy that it doesn't take up too much floor space.
I swear I'm not trying to troll you with this question, but if you had to guess, and you interviewed the entire population, how many individuals out of all the choices out there do you think would pick piano black as their finish? Because the reason I say it's not a joke is because that's a very popular finish for our industry. Very popular.
We went from veneered fronts for the Gibbons. We went from veneered fronts to piano black fronts. For us, there were a lot of upsides. The front veneers didn't have to be perfect matches.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So one of the nice things about a paint finish is that beneath the paint, it could be anything. You could be hiding a multitude of sins below the paint. You could use more exotic and maybe better materials underneath and not have to worry about what they look like because you're going to get an opaque finish. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of upside to it. That was one of the reasons we wanted to have our fronts. Previously, all of our fronts were flush with the sides, but with the black fronts, our new Gibbons, the front actually stands a little bit proud. It stands out about 1/4 of an inch from the bamboo part of the cabinet, and we wanted that finish to just sort of pop. And we also wanted the black drivers to vanish into the front a little bit so that people didn't feel like they needed to use grills. There's a lot of reasons to want to go with a consistent color on the front versus wood grain. That all was able to happen because I was able to get my crazy wood grain rocks off with the orangutan styling, which is all about the wood. It's wood first presentation on those fronts. The 093, 096, the O-Ref, they're all presenting this beautiful pair matched, mirror image book matched.
I did notice that, yeah.
Front. So I'm getting all of that silliness done on that line where people want that.
How does that happen? How do you get this? Is it cut from like the same piece of wood and then split into two pieces? Lengthwise?
Yeah. So veneers are essentially.
Oh, it's a veneer.
They're they're veneers. So they're essentially 1/48 of an inch thickness, and it's just these slices, continuous slices of a log, and each of those slices is as much similar as it can possibly be, and so. If you have really narrow slices, they're going to change a lot. But if you have a nice wide log that you're slicing from, you can get 4 or 8 slices across the two fronts of a pair of speakers, and it's totally consistent. And there's a perfect match.
And they're gorgeous. Like they're gorgeous.
I love that look. Yeah. I love that look, and it highlights the beauty of wood for me. And then we're not using solid wood because we need the consistency. Those veneers are then pressed on a very high quality Baltic birch front. So the fronts are all Baltic birch, and we let the birch edges show on the fronts.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that way we can actually put different woods on that and just be changing the veneers and not actually be changing the resonant characteristics. If we were changing solid woods, it would actually be changing different things about the speaker.
Is there something special about birch that I don't know about?
Birch ply there's a few types of plywood that are really sort of the top quality, and birch ply is one of them. And essentially what you're looking for is absolute consistency. Mm-hmm. You want to make sure that in those plies, so plywood is essentially, it's the plies of the plywood are thin pieces of wood stacked up like the pages of a book and then glued and pressed down together so that you've got a very consistent, you don't have knots, you don't have different densities of wood as it gets towards the edge of a log or the center of a log. And so plywood allows you to have a very consistent material, and the best grades of plywood they assure you that they have no voids so that when you're machining a baffle, you don't end up with a big hole all of a sudden that just blows out everything. Mm-hmm. So the top grades have no voids. They have thinner plies. They're higher density, and they're premium quality. So that when you're doing the machining and you're getting those perfect edges, you don't have problems that show up that were buried somewhere in the middle of a sheet.
Man, this is really showing my naivety because I literally in my mind, I thought solid wood has to be the best. But you bring up such a good point. The
Right.
inconsistencies, the density in the areas across. A solid wood thing is not as solid as you think. It's actually the opposite, you're saying. It has inconsistencies, therefore the solidity of it is
Right.
less than if you had perfect plies across each other to do equal
Anyone
distribution.
who's done woodworking knows that if you're cutting a piece of pine and there's no knot, it cuts so easily, like butter across it. If you're cutting and there's a knot there, forget it. It's 10 times higher density than it is in the regular sapwood part of it. So yeah, that's a huge exaggerated example. But pine, the difference between a knot and the sapwood is enormous. So yeah, there's density variations.
Wow.
A lot of the companies who use solid wood often will have the solid wood on the outside of another material to make their cabinet. Maybe it's MDF or something inside there.
Yeah.
Some actually do, and more power to them. It's difficult to work with, but some companies are actually making solid wood cabinets, like butcher block style solid wood.
Yeah. Wow. I that's like my takeaway from this interview. I learned something new, and I love that because I was kind of married to the idea of like, man, wouldn't it be great if we just cut a tree down, hollowed it out, and put a speaker in there? It'd be so great. But you bring up a really great point. It might not be the result you think, or the perception of solidity is now turned on its head.
Or pair 2 doesn't sound that much like pair 23.
Exactly
or
right.
pair 140.
And that's a really big issue because aside from all the risk you take with drivers, because I'll be honest with you, I've had a lot of experience with transducer variation in this, not in the speaker space as much, but in the headphone space, where it's literally just a transducer and it's so naked in that way without the room, right? And the same headphone. And so if you guys listen to, this is a very old podcast, but I did an interview with someone who was measuring collectively headphones to get an average mean of what the frequency was. And in some cases they did,
because headphones they're intentionally not just a flat frequency, like the typical loudspeaker manufacturer is targeting essentially a flat frequency response, but headphones are not like that.
Yeah, and some are more fun than others.
Yeah,
and some I don't know where you stand on this. We may have talked about it last time, but usually the word that comes up is the Harman curve, right? How do they take the Harman curve into consideration? But this specific example, I said, well, what is the variance? I don't care what the curve is. What's the variance from headphone to headphone was the question, and this guy was like, it depends by brand. And by that, I'm assuming he meant some people have it on lock and key,
right?
But others do not.
Yeah.
And I can't speak to what he didn't specifically say what brand he'd want to, and I'm not here to trash talk any. But I have had I don't do this as much anymore, but sometimes I would get, because headphones you could get, they're lighter and transfer, I'd get 2 pairs in.
Oh, yeah.
And I would be like, oh no. And
really?
I'm supposed to be reviewing this, and they would be, they'd be like very different.
Right.
Sometimes I usually would be like, well, the one that I think sounds better is the right one, right? But what if I was, it's like that's my preference, and the other one is the intent. So it's always a bit of a thing.
Or there's just no standard, and they're just putting them out as they put them out. I mean, I don't know. Transducer variation is a real thing, absolutely. In the beginning, we were matching drivers, and we were sort of speccing drivers, and we had a certain number that we had to hit in order to build a speaker with a particular woofer or tweeter. So Seas has been my driver manufacturer. Seas is a company in Norway, and they are one of the oldest still existing driver manufacturers in the world. So they're the ones who actually make the tweeters, mid-ranges, woofers, and all that kind of thing. A lot of the other famous companies came from Seas, so engineers and stuff who left Seas. They started VIFA, they started ScanSpeak. It's kind of amazing. But from the very beginning, they were the main supplier for us. And as we continued with them, I just realized that their driver-to-driver consistency was better than any other brand that we had ever measured and worked with. And the higher the percentage of drivers we had them make for us, the less issues we had in production. And essentially to the point where for most of the stuff we build, we don't even match. It's not until the very end when the speaker is finished and we put the pair up and we do a quick test that anything ever shows and nothing ever does. The only things that ever show there are maybe something was wired wrong and we need to reset it, or there may be a problem with damage on one of the drivers, something like that needs to be put out. But never because of an inconsistency anymore.
One of the things I think is really interesting, and we talked about the width of your speaker lines, but one of the other factors about your speaker line, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that one is actually like more sensitive than the other. Is that correct?
Yes. So the wider ones are the higher sensitivity. The narrow ones, because of the sort of trends, when I started the company in 2001, I had two speakers. I had a tiny bookshelf stand mount, and then I had a tower speaker, which was a 6.5-inch two-way. And they were skinny. And then the speakers that developed from there, the Silverbacks, Gibbon Super 9s, the Standard 9s, they all maintained that skinny, narrow profile. Because honestly, I didn't want to, I was just starting out. I wanted to make sure. We may or may not have covered this in the first time I spoke to you, but the impetus for me starting the company was to make speakers that were completely normal looking, but that were higher sensitivity and that were easier to drive than other speakers that were out there. I was essentially trying to camouflage their ease of driving and their high sensitivity elements. I was trying to camouflage them and make them look as normal, and wanted them to sort of essentially almost blend in a hi-fi store. Mostly because I thought that's the only thing that somebody was going to buy. That had to look like that in order for it to be marketable in any way. And then I added my thing to it by making them very easy, very flat, 8 ohms, very tube friendly, that kind of a thing. 12 years ago, so more than 12 years ago, probably 15 years ago at this point, when I started the development of the Orangutan series, I thought that was going to be the oddball. I figured that was going to be the super niche. The only dealers that were going to sell those were the dealers that sold Shindo and Airtight and super exotic, low power, fringe types of systems. And I was fine with that. I was just like, look, the Gibbon series, I've got my Silverbacks. That series is going to continue on. And as I designed the Orangutans, initially, the first thing was obvious that I needed to use big woofers. They had to be two-way. Two-way is just, and this may or may not be controversial, but in my experience, a two-way, no matter how sensitive it is, a two-way is just easier for a single-ended triode amplifier to drive than more than a two-way. A one-way is even easier. So, you're from the very beginning, the Orangutans were designed to be as easy as possible for that high output impedance single-ended triode tube amplifier. So instantly I knew I needed big woofers. So that instantly meant non-narrow cabinets. And I just kept on widening the cabinet. And one of the things that I realized, which is common sense really, is that the wider the cabinet, the more of the sound that's coming out of the speaker is directed forward. It's something called a step response. A step response is essentially the frequency of a speaker, and every speaker has a step response, at least one. And that's the frequency where the wavelength coming off of those drivers becomes significantly wider than the front of the speaker. And what's happening is the wave launch from the speaker is turning it from a hemispherical launch. Half a circle is essentially radiating out in a giant three-dimensional hemisphere to a sphere. And you're essentially losing all of that power. The wave launch, the frequencies, the sound that's radiating off of those drivers starts to wrap around the speaker cabinet when the wavelengths become significantly longer, like a multiple of the width of the speaker. And what happens if you just look at the frequency response, if everything is designed to be anechoically flat, the response from that speaker system will drop off a certain amount at that frequency, where the wave launch becomes spherical instead of hemispherical, and you lose sensitivity. A textbook way to address that is to essentially decrease the sensitivity of the speaker above where that happens. It's called a step response compensation network. And essentially what you're doing is you're throwing away sensitivity because the sensitivity of the lower frequencies is lower because you're just washing it out into the sides of the room and behind the speaker and everything like that. And so as I made those speakers wider, I pushed the frequency that step response occurs lower and lower and lower to a point where it was so low that I could compensate for it by tuning the bass response. So I could play around with the response from that woofer as it was coming out, rather than having to throw away sensitivity and bring down the response of the tweeter and the upper part of the woofer. And that instantly gave me several dB more room sensitivity than I would have had otherwise. I got to say, what I learned working out all the kinks of the drivers and the cabinets and everything with the Orangutan series, it was eye-opening, really eye-opening. It immediately reminded me of my experience with the Boston Acoustics, with the A series to the T series. It also made me realize that the imaging thing was a bit of a myth.
In what way?
Let's go deep here for a second.
Yeah.
Follow me.
I got my headlamp on. I'm ready. Let's go.
So our brain, right? Our brain is floating around in this pitch black little pond in our head. It's pitch black. The brain doesn't know anything at all. And it's receiving stimuli from all of our various senses from everywhere. But it's just noise. It's just scrambled stuff. It's just impulses. They're not seeing through a window. Our eyes are not windows. There's no little brain person looking with their little brain eyes out our eyes, right? Our eyes are making electrical signals going into a brain in a black box. Mm-hmm. So the brain isn't seeing. The brain isn't hearing. The brain isn't feeling temperature or wind. It's essentially what's happening in our minds is what's called a controlled hallucination. A hallucination is essentially the brain making something up that's happening, right? Oh my God, you're turning into a mushroom. We all know that that's not really happening, but all of my senses, my brain is telling me that my senses are portraying you. There's a mushroom and there's a rainbow coming out of your nose right now, right? A controlled hallucination is exactly what our brains are doing all the time. What our brains are doing is that they're taking all of that sensory data and they're predicting what is causing those senses to hit them. And so they're saying, okay, light from a certain frequency from a certain direction indicates that almost certainly this is what's happening in front of me. This feeling, these electrical impulses from my ear area of my brain are indicating a certain thing is happening. So imaging on a pair of speakers is a very complicated thing that's happening.
Right.
And we're able to fool our little hallucinating organ in our head into believing that there's a band playing. And it's an awesome thing to be able to do. And the fact that we tapped into that capability decades and decades and decades ago is just the fucking coolest thing. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's what makes high-end audio awesome, is the fact that we can hallucinate that Ella Fitzgerald is alive and singing with Ray Brown and Oscar Peterson in my damn room right now while I'm having a beer. And I can pause her and go take a piss and come back, and she'll still be there, and she'll still be just as awesome, right?
Yeah.
But the nuances of the information that's coming off the speakers that's giving us that impression of what's happening in the room are numerous. There's so much stuff. It's not just these tweeters and woofers vibrating and sending these like little laser beams at our ears. It's so much nuance. So there's room response, but there's also, if you've got a step response or you've got something strange happening in the speaker system in critical mid-band, our ears are most sensitive in the mid-range because it's where human voice happens. And so we're just very, very attuned to real minutia, phase issues, response issues, timing issues. And so if you have some sort of a group delay or if you have a lot of weird shit going on in that area, your imaging may be affected. It's one of the most delicate parts of the whole package.
Right, it's delicate.
It's one of the things that can go away first, right? what I discovered when I made these wide speakers is that they fucking imaged like crazy. They imaged better than a lot of little narrow speakers that I had heard. And one of the reasons is that there's less weird shit going on to make them work in that mid-range. More of that mid-range energy is being launched from the speaker more consistently because I've pushed the frequency at which it's not a hemisphere anymore, all the way down below the mid-range. So there's less things going on. There's less things that are utterly unnatural. Like that stuff is utterly unnatural. If Ella and Ray and Oscar were in my room jamming, none of the stuff that's coming from them would have any of those elements in it, those sort of odd little cues about the location of where those sounds are coming from.
Yeah.
And so the deep dive into the Orangutan series was amazing. Why I started this whole thing is that I was afraid that they were going to be niche and that nobody was going to be interested in them and they were going to be too maybe quote-unquote retro for the market. Within a year of launching the 096, it was our top-selling model. And it was immediately followed by the 093, which became our second best selling speaker, outselling all of those two models, outselling all of the Gibbons and Silverbacks that were in existence at that point. So that was a myth too, right? The myth that customers had to have these narrow speakers. That was the only kind of thing that was going to sell. In certain retail environments, it's the only thing that's going to sell, but that's because of the people selling, not because of the people buying necessarily. Mm-hmm. The orangutan, that first orangutan, the 096, also got a really strong following with so there's the wife acceptance factor, which is it's a dated term. There's maybe significant other acceptance factor, but essentially what they're referring to is the way it looks in your room. How does it look in your room? And the 096 looked great in a room because it was a furniture style thing. It had a style that didn't harken back to high tech speakers. It harkened back to an end table or a console or a vintage speaker maybe, and it had a hardwood stand and you could get different veneers on the front. And so it got accepted into more living rooms. It didn't have to sort of sit in a out-of-the-way listening room with a locked door. It actually made it into public spaces. That was the other thing that inspired me to make the reference product an orangutan instead of a silverback, something that followed a silverback into a bigger and more extreme design. And it was great. It was the right choice. The O-refs are they're remarkable and they're very flexible. Because I made them into 4 pieces, the 2 bass machines can go almost anywhere in a room, and they're adjustable. The rest of the system, the Ref A cabinets, literally go where a pair of 096s would go in a room, and they do their magic in that way. The other thing that's been going on, just to bring it back to the very beginning, which is where I started talking about the refs, is the newest products, which are new, most affordable pairing. So it's the O Baby and the Micro. So again, 2 orangutans. Mm-hmm. The O Baby is essentially a miniaturized 096. And the Micro is that exact same tweeter and woofer from the O Baby. It's a 6.5-inch version of our orangutan blue paper, untreated paper woofer, put in a 10 by 10 inch cube, sealed cube, designed to sit on a record shelf or bookshelf and blend in perfectly. And they're tuned to basically load a room from a wall boundary. That all came directly from the experience of designing the ref. It all just came from that.
Today's episode of the Occasional Podcast is sponsored by Inuos. Inuos engineers innovative, artful, hi-fi products that deliver unexpected warmth and accuracy. Products that unleash the full potential of digital music playback. Going beyond simple ones and zeros, Inuos products elevate music enjoyment by offering true audiophile performance from your digital music library or hi-fi streaming service. Find an Inuos dealer near you to hear the difference. Today's episode of the Occasional Podcast is sponsored by Purist Audio Design. Quality audio deserves quality sound, like the purest of diamonds. Purest Audio Design, one of the originals and high-end, just launched their Diamond Revision. With improved metallurgy, flexibility, and enhanced shielding to protect your system from RFI, EMI, interference from noisy wireless devices, the Diamond Revision, just like all of Purest cables, is made right here in the US of A. For over 35 years, Purest Audio Design has passionately made high-end, handcrafted audio cables designed specifically for the needs of your system. They list their specs, such as resistance and shield quality, and you can find them at puristaudiodesig.com. Purest Audio Design is veteran-owned and available worldwide.
Earlier, you were talking about imaging being one of those things that convinces our brains to be fooled, and the idea of realism. And people who listen to the show will know that one of the things that's like so similar to what you're saying that fooled me initially when I started coming to audio shows and really hearing high-end system was dynamics, like the start and the stop of a driver. Because for whatever reason, my brain, it really associates the stop and the start with real life. So like when your voice is projected to me, the leading edge is just whatever you produced, right?
Right.
But for some reason, my brain, the transducers, I could always tell when it was trying to fool me because the leading edge would be a little blurred or a little whatever, or the noise, it didn't come as sharply from start to stop. The reaction that I always had was, I got a little freaked out. I got a little scared because I'm like, this thing, whatever is happening, all of a sudden feels more real than it normally does. And that for me was part of that. And you're right. Yeah. It is very precarious. It's very precious. It's very like a thing that can fall apart so easily.
And it's hard to define exactly what it is. But yeah, that's a good one. That kind of impulse response, the transient response, is another key to putting something in the room with you versus listening to a recording of it.
Yeah, and a lot of the guys I talk to that are into more the digital side, the DSP, also speak of like, how do we know as a species that something is above us? Right, so in a very hunter-gatherer sense, it's very imperative if we know if we're being hunted from above or not. Yeah. And the ear is shaped and created in a certain way. And how do we, in turn, create waterfall effects from above? And can it be done artificially in a believable way?
Right.
And I also thought that was a very interesting
It's like old school, like the Q sound they did for a while, right? That was in the 80s and maybe 90s, I guess. Q sound, it was a processing that was found in a bunch of studios. And from two channels, you would get stuff behind you.
Behind you?
Yeah. And what was nice about it is that it didn't have to be set up as carefully as some. You would lose some. I mean, I know Pink Floyd or Roger Waters played with it. There's maybe Sting. I know Living Colour, the band, had a couple of records that had some Q sound in it. It's kind of fun little. It was a good demo trick.
Yeah.
When we were selling hi-fi in the 90s.
Yeah, demo tricks.
Yeah.
And they're very, binaurals, fun. Yeah. I've had some very fun experiences.
And imaging height. People don't think about, they think about imaging from a pair of speakers in a room as being a horizontal phenomenon, right? So there's far right things happening, far left things happening, center things happening. Maybe you get a little bit of soundstage depth, but you also actually get, in a properly set up system, assuming the system can do it, there's absolutely height information in there. Vocalists will be up above a drum kit, and things will be happening from different places in a vertical orientation as well. And that's, again, all very subtle spatial cues.
Anything to add on that? Considering, I feel like, and you can correct me again if I'm wrong here, generally speaking, as far as all the speakers out there, have you made a choice to make your speakers sit at a lower level? Because I feel like in my mind's eye, when I see at least the orangutans, they are, the tweeter, I think, is probably aimed ear height, is it not?
Below ear height.
Really?
Yeah. They were designed. So, yeah, when I first launched them, everyone was like, "Oh, my listening chair is too high," or I put some blocks under them and now they're at ear height, or I tilted them back, and I'm like, no, none of that. No. So measuring speakers from the tweeter axis became a thing, mostly because you're going to get the highest frequency extension when you're doing your frequency sweeps from a direct line to the tweeter. But that's not necessarily where the multiple drivers are going to sound best when listened from. So there's a few things. So the frequencies, there's a time element to sound coming off of a speaker. And what you want is to make sure that the time element of the different drivers, the tweeter, the mid-range, the woofer, the time element reaches the listening position in a way that they can blend properly. So in the terrible situation, they reach your ear completely out of phase. One driver is doing one thing, and another driver is doing the exact opposite. And so what happens when it reaches you at the listening position is that they cancel each other out, and you've got basically a null. And frequency response-wise, you see a big drop in the frequency response. That's a bad situation.
Yeah.
But there are other more subtle ways that the individual timing elements from those drivers reaches you. So the optimum listening axis from any speaker is designed in. So if you have a concentric driver with a tweeter in the middle of a woofer, then your optimum listening axis is going to be sort of a round thing. You're going to be sort of around the center of that driver. But as soon as you have the two locations of those drivers separated out, then you can in the design of the crossover and of the drivers and of the cabinet, you can position that listening axis wherever you want. So the optimum listening axis for any of the orangutans, all the orangutan speakers, including the O babies on their stands, all are the same height. And they all have the same listening axis. And that listening axis is above the top of the cabinet. So when you're sitting in front of a pair of O96s, you should actually be able to see the top of the cabinet a little bit. You shouldn't be hunched down so that you're at the tweeter level. And that is where the timing of the woofer and the tweeter, essentially it's a version of phase response. It's where that phase response makes the optimum listening axis, and it's the optimum frequency response. And they measure flat from above the cabinet. If you do a frequency response measurement from below, from the tweeter level or below that, you can see problems happening. And so what I wanted to make sure that unless you're lying on a futon on the floor, your ears are not going to be in that realm where where the speakers are not behaving as well. So as long as you're above the speakers, you keep a low speaker so that as long as you're above the speakers to some extent, or basically tweeter level and above, you're in the sweet spot for that design. It's the polar tilt listening axis. That is a designed-in part of the speaker. And I think most people don't realize that is part of the design. You can design that in. It doesn't just happen the way it happens.
You're talking about the vertical plane. Is there any type of imaging trick or design in your case for the speakers in regards to distance from? So you're talking about things arriving at a certain plane. That made my brain immediately think, well, how far away do I need to be? Because if they're traveling at different speeds, I know it's minute. But is there but
it accumulates. Yeah.
An equilateral triangle kind of vibe to this thing, or you say, well, I kind of design my speakers to be listened to from X far away?
Both. So the orangutans that use a 10-inch woofer, so that's the O93, the O-Ref, and the O96, those you need to be minimum 2 meters away. Because of the large woofer, those two drivers are far enough apart that it takes them a little while to gel. If you're too close to them, there is a listening axis, but it's going to be very, very small. It's a very small window, and it's going to be in an odd place. You may have to be standing up or something stupid like that. Where those drivers are, for them to come together to the perfect point, is farther away. With the O Baby, like I said, it's essentially a miniaturized O96. Everything is miniaturized. The tweeter's miniaturized. The woofer's miniaturized. I got rid of the tweeter faceplate entirely. And so those two drivers are very close together. And therefore, you can listen to a pair of O Babies much, much closer than you can a pair of O96s. And then everything past that, anything further back from that is totally fine. It's just a matter of where the minimum point where those things gel happens.
Huh, very cool.
Yeah.
You had spoken about efficiency on a couple of different occasions so far in the podcast. One of the things that has come up this season, or at least in the past couple of years, is this idea of does sensitivity in and of itself, vacate of everything else around it, have a sound? Because I think the question is interesting because when it comes to high sensitivity, there are a lot of interesting elements get introduced. Tubes sometime and all this. All these different ideas have a way to augment the sound. But by itself in a vacuum, in your opinion, from your experience, does the sensitivity have a positive, negative? Is it different? Because you really work on both sides of this coin with your products.
To some extent, yeah. So it's a tough question. And that's a tough question because there's so many things involved in what ends up as part of a measurement of sensitivity. Part of sensitivity is literally the impedance. A really low impedance speaker is technically, so sensitivity is a measure of efficiency. Efficiency is the actual thing that we're talking about. Sensitivity is one of the ways of measuring it. So if you measure the sensitivity of two speakers, one of them is 2 ohms and one of them is 8 ohms, and they are both the same sensitivity in voltage, the 2 ohm speaker is 4 times less efficient. So there's a lot of things going on in that calculus. Another thing is talking about damping. Heavier, highly damped systems will tend to be less efficient. Contrary to that, low damped systems will be more efficient. And you can think about that as the Q. So when we were talking about those resonances of, like the oil can resonance has that really high, sharp peak, and it's very narrow. So that's a high Q peak. That resonance has a high Q. A low Q will be the opposite of that. It'll be a very broad peak, but not as tall. And that's a low Q peak, and that's a heavily damped peak. One of the things, and this also has to do a little bit with arrival times, and you were talking about how this sort of snap of the leading edge of a dynamic. If it has a very low Q, then the rise time of that sound wave hitting you is gradual. It doesn't rise up right away. It's a gradual rise, and then it's also on the other end of that, it's a gradual fall back down to a 0 point. And it's damped in that it doesn't ring beyond that, but it is also not as sharp. High Q damping on the other side has a really sharp, very high, very steep leading edge, and then it falls off also very steeply and very quickly, but then it will ring a little bit on the other side of it because there's nothing controlling the energy to sort of bring it back to that 0 point. Yeah. So in some ways, it's more realistic sounding, but then it rings at the end. So again, it's more balancing all these things together. One of the things that people say about higher sensitivity speakers is that they sound better at low levels. And part of that, I think, is due to the damping. So when you've got a very low sensitivity speaker, a high percentage of the power that's going into that speaker is being converted to heat. It's just going away. It's making things hot, and that's it. To take it away from sort of scientific terms a little bit, it takes a little bit more to wake that system up. And what ends up happening is that it ends up having to play a little louder in a room, generally speaking, for it to sound better. With a high sensitivity speaker, generally it's converting less of the power from the amplifier into heat. You're getting a little bit more of it, and it just, for some reason, it sounds a little bit more alive at a low volume. As you turn things up and as you start to put a kilowatt into a very low sensitivity speaker, and you put 5 watts into a very high sensitivity speaker, and you start to get loud in room, things start to sound more the same because you've gotten past that initial sort of sleepiness of a low sensitivity system, and things are rocking. And with that high sensitivity system, things sort of equalize to some extent. You know, assuming that the sound of the speakers in some magical place is the same, right? Mm-hmm. So the high sensitivity and low sensitivity has less of a difference to it. For me, and this is one of the reasons that I started DeVore Fidelity, is that what I found when I was building my speakers before I officially started the company, let's say that there was a 2-way tower speaker in the store where I was selling retail that I liked a lot, but it needed a lot of juice. When I would build speakers that were similar in overall context to that, so maybe a 6.5-inch 2-way tower speaker, I found when I made them easier to drive, when I made them flatter impedance, when I made them a little bit higher sensitivity, all other things equal, they sounded better. And that, I think, is mostly not because of the speaker sounding better, but it's because of what you're driving it sounds better. If you're using an amplifier and it's working less hard, it's much more in its comfort zone, it's simply going to sound better. And it's going to make those speakers sound better, not because the speakers are better, but because the system as a whole sounds better. An amplifier that's not connected to anything doesn't even work, right? It's not even a circuit. It's not a circuit until the plus and minus are going through something, because otherwise it's just an open loop, right? There's nothing there. So you can put an 8-ohm resistor on it and then make it a circuit again, or you put a pair of speakers on there. And they finish the circuit. And so the circuit, that load across those terminals is affecting, it's literally in the circuit, it's affecting the sound of what you're going to get out of the system as a whole. So the better I can make those amplifiers sound, the better my speakers are going to sound. And that was from the very, very beginning. That was my aim.
Yeah, I feel like I got my homework assignment. I am way fired up on the idea of finding the best sounding speaker at a low volume.
Right.
That's not like a sandbox that we play in that often at the shows.
Right.
And I know I've heard it, but I just haven't been focused on the idea enough. Mm-hmm. And now that this is my mission this year. I want to find, because I have heard it. I've been in a store where I'm like, this sounds so sweet.
Right.
Just like a less than a conversational
just
level.
Just at the background, yeah.
And it's not always the goal. Mm-hmm. It's not always the aim. It's not always even in the thought set about what this speaker could or should be. Right. But for me this year, I think I'm going to take that task. I'm going to put that one to task and find out, because that is a very interesting proposal.
Mm-hmm. At a hi-fi show, though, just since we're recording this in a hi-fi show is probably the worst possible place to do that, right?
Not this.
Because you're in a room and they're cranking some, Stevie Ray Vaughan or God knows what, audiophile chestnut. And then you go into the next room and you're like, I want to hear how these sound at a low volume, but your ears are opened up by some loud thing that you just heard, or the sound from the next room is bleeding through. Somebody's got Eagles amused to death, hell freezes over, whatever fucking audiophile track that they're using, and the subwoofer is shaking the painting off the wall. Yeah. Listening at a low volume is going to suck no matter what. Yeah. So it's but in your own house, when you're used to shit, that's definitely try it.
Because I guess that for me, the proposal would really be: can I get something so sweet on the desktop that I can do while I'm doing a little something else, but I want it to sound like really juicy? Mm-hmm. It's a different goal. Right, than when I'm in the big listening room. So different goals are fun because it's a different puzzle to solve, completely different than the main listening in the room. And
the amplifier will influence that as well. Some amplifiers need to be pushing against something really difficult. The other thing that I learned with the Orangutan series, so the Orangutan series at this point is more than half of DeVore Fidelity's history. But let's say the half that's post-Orangutan versus the half that's pre-Orangutan. Pre-Orangutan, all my speakers were all 8 ohms. I wanted them to be driven to be perfectly drivable by anything. What I started to learn when I started doing the orangutans is the orangutans are all above 8 ohms. The two new ones, the Micro and the O Baby, are not. They're 8 ohms. Mm-hmm. But all the other ones, the O Refs are above 12 ohms. They're all high impedance because they were designed to be less universal and more biased towards tube amps. And what I've noticed is that some amplifiers just don't sound very good into those high impedances. You'd think that it would sound great because you get a higher damping factor, whatever it is, but my thesis on why this is, and I found there's actually tube amps and solid state that I've found this with. And that is because they're not intended for speakers that are high impedance. So every designer, unless it's just a corporate designed thing, every designer is going to have, let's say, every amplifier designer is going to have hopefully more than one speaker that they're going to do all of their testing and designing and developing on. But they're going to have at least one pair of speakers that is their benchmark speaker. My hope would be that they've got a handful of speakers so that they're not just tuning for one specific load, because that's a very specific thing. Yeah. My thesis is that since there are almost no speakers that are even 8 ohms, but certainly above 8 ohms. There are almost no modern speakers that are above 8 ohms in the market. These amplifier designers they're not going to have a pair of old Altecs. They're not going to have any of the 16 ohm speakers of yore as one of their designing and development models. They're going to have popular speakers. If it's a high-end company, maybe they're going to have Wilsons, or they're going to have Magicos. They're going to have speakers that tend to be significantly below 8 ohms. And so the design of the gear, and as they hone it into the best sounding amplifier they can make it, it's the best sounding into loads like that. And so I have found now over the years, I've found amplifiers, mostly the solid state ones. I've found a handful of amps that just don't sound as good into the 12 ohm 096 as they do into the 8 ohm Gibbons Super 9. They just don't. And you can hear that the amplifier is at fault, because I know the speakers enough and I've heard a million amplifiers on them that I recognize at that point that that's the issue, and it's just the amplifier. And I've spoken to the designers about that, and they're just like, and some of them have ordered 096s to see for themselves, and maybe their next generation of amps will address that to some extent. And some of them are just like, there's a tube amp company, and they're like, our output transformers are optimized for about 5 ohms, and they just are, and it makes sense because that's their perceived market. Yeah. So yeah.
I always wonder, we talk in general terms about synergy, right? But when you get away from blanket terms like that and get down into the weeds, like, the transformer is optimized, that makes just a lot more sense. And
Absolutely. And with big solid state amps, it seems counterintuitive that they sound better into brutal punishing loads. But if the circuit was developed and tuned to be best sounding into that punishing load, then it makes sense that it's just non-optimal for a super light, easygoing load. And it's kind of like that low sensitivity system that needs to get turned up a little bit. Some of it may be the speakers, some of it may be the amplifier that is best suited for a system like that, needing to push a little harder before it sounds its best. And its best may be mind-bogglingly awesome, but if you're not in that envelope of best, it can be blah, kind of boring sounding. And I've heard that. I've heard that with great amplifiers sound kind of blah into a non-optimal situation.
Have you ever considered designing an active speaker where you yourself handpick the perfect match for your speaker, and we take that entire thing out of the equation?
Absolutely not at all. No. I love it. The whole point, again, back to 25 years ago, the whole point of my speakers being as easy to drive as possible and as perfectly 8 ohms as possible is so that people can play around and discover the beauty of all these different amplifiers. Yeah. And it is beauty, right? We're searching, whatever we're searching for is beautiful to you, right? And I love that ability. Get some tiny, crazy, like vintage Class T tripath or whatever, or find, your perfect little single-ended triode or whatever it is that floats your boat. I want to make sure that my speakers allow that amp to be beautiful.
Yeah, tinkering, right? It's why we're here to rob people of an essential element of option, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's fun. Yeah, now that we've kind of talked about all that, one of the things I did want to bring up and talk about is how you actually do have a presence on social media yourself, you're personally, right? And you representing your company. Now, not everybody takes the time to, and not everybody should. I think this is important. There's not a right or a wrong way to do this, but you have chosen to, in a way, make yourself accessible. You yourself, your words accessible online. Was that a strategy, something you wanted to express yourself? And also, I really wanted to make sure people knew that you do amazing art. So we had been talking earlier about my feed is filled with a lot of things. My Facebook feed, my Instagram feed, they're filled with a lot of things that are of no interest to me. There's a lot of whatever. And then I'll see a hand-drawn ink on paper thing that you drew, and it brings light to my day. because
man.
is like an expression, and it's very pure to me, and it is a sea of marketing BS, and then a small piece of original art that I would not have seen otherwise. So I wanted to thank you for that. Are they on display anywhere else, or is it just the Facebook where they just...
Yeah, that's it. They essentially exist for social media. So all of my social media, I had a Facebook page, and DeVore Fidelity has a Facebook page, obviously way before COVID shutdowns. But everything beyond that's all a result of the COVID shutdowns. So the first thing I did, our factory is in Brooklyn, New York, and New York shut down completely. It was American ground zero for COVID in the very beginning. And so it shut down, everything shut down. We were not allowed, no employees. Essentially, DeVore Fidelity had to completely stop production. And it was a crazy time everywhere, and dealers were all closed. Obviously nobody had a storefront that was open, and so sales completely stopped for a couple of months. But I have cats. I have cats that live at the factory, so I was still going into DeVore Fidelity every day, going in to hang out with the cats, feed the cats, and just putter around. Work on a little design here and there, but there was literally nothing to do. I couldn't ship anything. I couldn't build anything. Production was stopped. And so after maybe a week of that, I was like, fuck, what am I going to do? And I was like, I'm going to make a video. I'm just going to make a video wandering around, looking at my records. And so I started the DeVore Fidelity YouTube channel. And very specifically, it's the DeVore Fidelity channel, and it's me on there. But it specifically did not want it to be a marketing channel for the brand.
Okay.
So anytime I'm ever talking about something that is a DeVore Fidelity speaker, I may be using it as an example of how something maybe interacts or maybe upcoming projects. This is what I've been doing, but that's a tiny, tiny minority of the content. The vast majority is record reviews. I talk about records that I love. Maybe I'll talk about an artist that I like, or I will talk about stuff that's going on. I've been doing some unboxing videos. And then the other thing that happened during COVID lockdown is my cousin, she's younger than me, and she grew up in New York. I grew up outside of Boston, but we would see each other periodically, and she liked the arts. After I graduated from art school, I moved to New York, and I would give her art lessons once or twice a week. And so I've always sort of liked her art, and she started doing this thing on Instagram called Inktober. And Inktober it was set up by an illustrator named Jake Parker. And essentially every day of October, so 31 days, every morning there's a new word, and that is supposed to prompt you to make art.
A single word.
A single word. It's the word that you use to come up with your idea. And she started doing Inktober. And I was looking at it, and every single day of that October, I was like, there was another piece of art, and I was thumbs upping and loving and, all that social media interaction that you do. And finally, I just reached out to her, and I was like, these are amazing. What is this? And she explained what it was that she was doing, and I checked it out, and I started doing Inktober, and that's how it started. So I start in the morning. I do them on the weekends. Mm-hmm. In the mornings, normal weekday mornings, I get my kid out to school, and I just go to the office, and that's that. But on the weekends, I'm the first one up in my house by hours. So I make coffee, and I sit down at my kitchen table and listen to the radio, and I look at the word for the day. And as I'm sipping my coffee, I rummage through my head to come up with an idea for that word. Whatever the word is. So if the word may be something obvious, I try to think of something non-obvious. Yeah. If the word is obvious, but it would be a delight to draw, I'll just do it, right? It's pure fun. But the end result is not just something in a sketchbook. The end result has to be, and this is part of the Inktober rules, is that you have to share it. For me, the end piece of art is not even the thing that is ink on paper in that sketchbook. The end result, the piece of art, is actually the picture that I take of it with my phone that I then post on Instagram and Facebook. That is the piece of art. So the art that I'm doing is digital art, but I'm actually doing it with a fountain pen and ink on a piece of paper. But then I'm taking a picture of it and converting it to the art. And that's a big part of it. Jake Parker was like, you have to share it. Yeah. And that made all the difference. I went to art school. As a kid, all I did was draw. All I did was draw. And I went to art school without even thinking twice about it. Technically, I started building speakers during art school. But I was supposed to go to New York, and I was supposed to become a famous painter and become rich and live in a giant loft in Soho, and that was my plan, right? And then I get to New York, and I'm like, fuck, how am I going to do that? That's impossible. I can't do this. Oh, my God. And then this whole idea of like being self-motivated to make these paintings and make them awesome, it just wasn't going to happen. And I was hanging out. I was building speakers, and so I became an illustrator for a few years. And I did a bunch of books for Scholastic, kids' books and stuff like that. And that was tough because I was always butting heads with the art director because my ideas were so much better than hers and she was so stupid and whatever. It was like totally typical stuff that one deals with. As a writer, you're dealing with your editor and all that kind of stuff. And it was a hassle, and the money was so tiny. I basically stopped doing art for years and years and years. And the only art I would do is that I would make, before I had a family, I would do it for myself. And then after, with the family, I would make a Christmas card. And it would be I would hand make the Christmas card every year, and then we would print them out. And the Inktober was the perfect version of that had a lower bar of entry, right? The Christmas card has to be perfect. It has to be, everyone has to love it. I don't want to offend any weird uncles, right? That bullshit. But the Inktober was like, I don't even have to think of the concept, because the concept, it's like, right? It's not like the concept is there, but the word is there to light the fuse on the concept. So I just have to sit there and let the coffee go percolate around enough so that the fuse hits, and then boom, I just make it. And that's it. It's so great. And the fact that I have to finish it and publish it, it's not anything until it's done. Right. That has upped my game. And I've been doing now these Inktobers. I don't do them in October. I just go back to old lists. I think I'm on the 2016 list now for them. That morning, I open it up, look at that word, and I've been doing them now for a couple of years, and I love it. It's like a meditative practice. It's a focus. It's a sort of wonderful way of being able to focus. It's a morning head clearing ritual where it's almost like that word, whatever the stupid word is, becomes a koan that becomes the only thing in my head. And then I've got to build the idea on that, and then releasing it. And then feedback I get, people saying, I love seeing your drawings on the weekends. I just feel like I'm putting something that's nice. I'm putting a nice thing out there in the world. And I love it, man. It's one of the best things that happened from COVID. Absolutely. A great silver lining for me.
Yeah, I want to just really iterate to people that I think that these small things that you talk about in terms of like personal development, and I'm not like a therapist or anything like that for you guys, but I think if you can find something like exactly like you're talking about individually for yourself, that's a small growth thing. And for you, obviously, it's a lifelong passion for you, but like trying things.
But that's the thing. Like, make sure that the cost of entry is small, right? Yeah. Don't make it a huge thing. Yeah. Like the Christmas card was almost big. Like we would put it off until the fucking last minute. Whereas the Inktober is small. Some of my drawings are like these little 20-minute things, and they're just like little morsels. And some of them I go deep, and it's hours of rendering and cross-hatching and
Yeah.
And but that's it. It's like, as long as it's not scary to start, and then just let it finish when it's done. And I look at the first ones that I was doing a couple of years ago, and you could see how hard it was for me, and how stiff I was, and how worried I was about the concepts every time. But doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it for week after week after week after week, it's a joy. It's awesome. And my facility has gotten better. I think the drawings have gotten better. I think my ideas have become a little bit more interesting. So yeah, do it. Anything you can find.
Yeah.
Start knitting. Whatever it is, man.
Yeah. That's the thing about creation that I love is, and part of the magic formula, I think, is that you have the tinder, you have the start of the flame, you have the process, and the process is consistently being augmented, right? So it's not like you're sitting at a blank slate sweating over it. You got everything you need to get it going, and you're doing it. And the exercise of being creative in whatever shape you find, and it could be a simple songwriting exercise if you're a musician, all this.
Absolutely.
But expressing yourself in a way that is an outlet and a personal growth, I cannot express how much I think that adds to life, in my opinion.
It adds to life, and it makes the whole world better.
Yeah, and you're creating something that other people get joy from. Yeah. And I find it one of the things I find very interesting about this idea is that it's not done till it's complete. Because that's the part I like, the fact that when I write music, I get to share it on the podcast. At least I know I've written so much music no one will ever hear and probably shouldn't hear. But like to do something for the podcast, even though it's just a little thing here and there, I feel like that's an important step.
And it has to be carried to that point. Yeah, exactly. Right. And you know when it's ready.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my music's never quite ready, but you...
Right. But if you've published it, then you know it's ready enough for that.
At least
it's
done,
like, that's a point. Yeah, that's a point.
That's great. Funny thing about my experience with your art is that I didn't know that the word was a key, and I was dying to know where it came from. Because some of them, I was like, this is clearly wrapped around something, but I have no idea what that something was until this point.
Yep. Yeah, the word will be on there somewhere in quotes. So I'll sign it and put the prompt. It's their prompt words. So the prompt word will be in there at the bottom. And then when I share it, it's always tagged with the prompt word. Because in Instagram, the Inktober thing is a thing. And there's thousands and thousands of artists, amateurs, professionals. There's a lot of Inktober art out there. And so I always hashtag the prompt word as well in there.
Well, they do kind of a similar execution on Reddit where it's like a writing prompt. They'll give you like a pretty good
I mean, it's a great exercise, a well-known and really, I think, effective exercise.
Yeah, that's awesome. And your medium is a fountain ink pen on paper, correct?
Yeah. So I'll do a quick pencil sketch, and then I'll do the drawing with a fountain pen on ink. Yeah, and I like the fountain pen. Technically, Inktober has to be an inked drawing. Because Jake Parker's illustrations, he's a brilliant ink drawer. But there's a lot of people who do the Inktober's on a tablet with a digital pen, whatever. I mean, honestly, it's just about getting the art going. I wanted to stick to ink. And so I did some early on. I did some with markers and with ballpoints and stuff like that. When I was really doing art a lot, I used to use fountain pens, or I used to actually use dip pens, like crow quill pens. I learned how to do that.
What about like an old quill feather? Yeah, have you tried that?
I've tried. I've made my own feather quills. Yeah, I don't recommend that.
It's tough.
They don't last long at all. They you need 1 million of them. But there are steel versions of that. These dip pens. They're called crow quill pens, but they're steel. And it's like the predecessor to the fountain pen. The fountain pen has a lot in common with those crow quill dip pens, but you can fill them with ink, so the ink runs down through the pen, and you can actually do it. And I like the feel. I like using real ink. Real ink is there's a real black to it, at least with vintage ones. And I'm actually doing some experiments, and I'll talk about this a little bit on the YouTube channel eventually. But I've been trying to find the best drawing fountain pen tips, and so I'm kind of exploring into that. But I love it. It's all right now. It's all vintage fountain pens because they're more flexible. I use a vintage fountain pen, and
is it dying? Are the
no.
is the available products getting smaller and smaller?
No, there's a huge market for fountain pens. Definitely, there's like the high end ones that have existed forever. The Mont Blancs and the Waterman, and those are all beautiful, but those are not good drawing pens. If you get one of those pens, especially Pelicans, I love Pelicans, and Pelican currently makes very expensive, fancy pens, but they're for writing, and they don't have flexible nibs, so you don't get a line variation as you do variations in how hard you're pressing on the paper. You can actually vary the line, and so you have to get some of the vintage Pelicans to do that, and that's what I mostly use. It's a vintage 1950s Pelican pen.
That's an interesting part of it, because with a ballpoint pen, you maybe can do it, but it doesn't go the width doesn't expand as quickly. So it gives you one more little tool in your toolbox when you're doing it.
Yep.
That's very interesting. Well, please doing it. I enjoy them greatly, and like I said,
thank you.
There's a sea of social media out there that is just and to have a little piece of that out there, I think brightens the world. And there are other people who do it. There's one gentleman who simply takes photos on his walk of flowers that he sees.
Nice.
It's the simple little thing like that too, where I'm just his morning walk every day. He takes a picture of a flower. And I'm like, God, that's all I want to see when I'm
Right.
sitting there making my way through the thing. But
Yep.
yeah, so I appreciate your work, and on both sides of the coin, and thank you so much for making like speakers that are uniquely a vision of yours. I feel like through this conversation, it's something that you want everybody to enjoy, but it's not 100% about you creating something that will make you the most money.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah. So that part of it is cool too. There is,
and it's a nice surprise when something that I approach thinking it's going to be a total niche, like the 096, ends up being our best seller. So it's nice when the things do coincide, because the success of the 096 has essentially fueled the projects that have followed it. It all works towards the same end, I guess.
Very cool. John, thanks so much for coming on the show, man. Really appreciate your time here.
That's been great. Thanks. A pleasure.
The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes parttimeaudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA newsletter, and audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter. Executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. The Occasional Podcast and its original associated music is monitored, mixed, and mastered on the Focal Trio 6 BE studio monitors. If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.